All right, AJ, it is wonderful to have you on the show today. We were just chatting off air, and I said, I'm this total LinkedIn stranger that reached out, but it's really because your content resonated with me. Parts of your story really hit home for me, and I thought, I would love to share this on my podcast. So thank you so much for being here and kind of taking a chance on a stranger, I guess. So for those people listening who have no idea who you are, tell us a little bit about you.
Well, thank you, Candice, for the warm introduction, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always nice, I think, these kind of random connections that you just happen through LinkedIn and other platforms, and so much of it feels like just like orchestrated, right? It's not in your hands, and then a few weeks later, here you are on a podcast with somebody you've never really met. But no, so my name's Ajay. I'm a learning and development professional. I sort of have been in L&D for about 20 years. And I currently also am building out my own storytelling consultancy called Tell More Stories. So 20 years really within corporate L&D. So mostly large sort of enterprise companies. And I was, within the global L&D team, looking at content, strategy, platforms, the whole shebang. And last year, or just about 18 months ago, I took a step back to also think through what the next 20 years looks like, right? So it felt like a good moment to just pause and reflect, because our industry, as you know, is going through so much change and disruption. So it just felt, like a good moment, to just sort of think about how do I add value. How do I make impact in this next phase in my career? And one of the things I'm thinking through is how do I really connect storytelling to learning and development? But we can talk about that more later on. Yeah.
Yes, it's so necessary. That human side, right? And we can all just relate to that story. To stories. And so I love that. But we will get there. First of all, I always say it's my favorite part of the podcast. Let's travel back in time to young you. I always say, what was that first dollar you earned? What were you doing? How old were you? At that first little taste of independence.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, it's great to go down memory lane a little bit, right? So I remember when I was in high school, one of the things I've always enjoyed doing is writing. I've just always just loved the process of, um, working with words in whatever form that is. So I just loved reading, obviously, from an early age. And then when it came to going to university, I didn't really know what I wanted to major in, if that makes sense. So I kind of wanted to keep my options open, and luckily I found a degree that let me do that. So I could do three majors, and this was at a university here in India where I was at the time. And so I picked journalism, and I picked literature, and I picked psychology. And that was my way of just keeping my options open. And truthfully, I think journalism felt at the time like the most likely career path, just because I thought that was going to be the job that let me write and, sort of just be creative. And turns out it wasn't anything like that. So I tried a bit of journalism, and I realized I was maybe romanticizing journalism a little bit. I mean, there was writing involved, obviously, but this was, before the sort of print media, digital media was still in its infancy. So it was largely print media. And the whole process of writing for print publications, and that process of, you know, your whatever you're writing being edited and then finally going to print, that whole process, it just seemed very mechanical. There didn't seem too much space or room for creativity. It was all very, deadline driven, and it's, very limited space, just real estate, right, on the paper. And so for all those reasons, I realized, maybe journalism wasn't the thing that I was supposed to do. Um, but thankfully,
So did you work in journalism for a
yeah,
while you
it
were
was,
studying?
yeah,
You did.
just a couple of stints. I did an internship here and there. So I wrote for a small independent publication, and just to get a feel for it, right? But so yeah, I decided very early on that maybe journalism wasn't the thing that I was meant to do, or that I really enjoyed. And then thankfully, I knew somebody at the time who worked for a little company that was design or building e-learning. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and he said, look, why don't you come and just apply? He, and if you get the job, then you can just do the job while you figure out what you want to do. And that's how I kind of fell into L&D. It was my first job in L&D, so very much an accidental L&D professional, like many of
Mm-hmm.
us. And I started out in instructional design, and it turns out, yeah, my love for writing, my degree in psychology, all of this sort of came together, and so it was creative work, and it was also fun because it was this emerging field, and we were starting to build, interactive e-learning, and there was all this excitement about where this would go as an industry, and so it felt like the right kind of place to be, and that ended up being my first job and my first introduction to L&D, and that sort of experience there is what sort of one thing led to another, and here we are 20 years later.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I want to pause there a little bit, and I can see how all these pieces come together so beautifully, actually, for e-learning and instructional design, and really bringing learning together. I actually look at learning like a movie. Whenever I'm designing something, it's like, what are the scenes? What is the plot? Where are people going? What is the vibe? All of that stuff. So I really that it hits home for me. But I want to know, because that's 20 years ago, and I think you need to paint the picture a little bit more, because I've also been in L&D for 20 years. I started in 2007, so
Mm,
19 years, almost 20.
yeah.
And back then, I remember, and I worked, for a Fortune 500 company, and we started getting e-learning, and I was like, whoa, we can do something online and people can get it. So I think you need to paint the picture, because you started sort of at the beginning, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it felt like at the beginning. I think it was, obviously it was around in some form, for a while before that, even in the 60s, and maybe the 70s, it was starting to grow out a bit more. But I remember when I started, so a couple of, for a few years, I was within the educational publishing industry. So this first job that I had really was just actually building out e-learning, and it was for Fortune 500 companies, the likes of which you may have worked for, and they were sort of, yeah, I think just dipping their toes in the water, right, of this whole digital learning world. And I think many of them was just like you described. That it was still quite new. They maybe didn't have the skills in house, and so they were looking for companies to partner with who had very specialist skills, who could put these things together. And so I, ended up in a little pod, in a little team of a small team of 4 or 5 of us, and that was how these were set up. And it's funny how all these years later, that basic setup still hasn't changed that much. But
Mhm.
essentially, there would be one person doing the instructional design. There would be another person doing the graphic design and the programming. And then there would be a project manager that sort of brings it all together and communicates with the client and so on, right? So that was our kind of the way we were set up and the way we worked. And I didn't know anything about instructional design when I joined. So this was very new to everybody, and the company was growing quite fast because there was a lot of demand for this e-learning suddenly. So we had to, so we were hiring and training and working on projects all at the same time. So this was really kind of learning by doing. And that's my first experience of this, right? Just getting thrown in the deep end. And it was like our onboarding was really like a boot camp. It was very intensive, because you had to start working on this stuff fairly quickly, right? So we were given books to read. I still remember Ruth Clark's, e-learning and the science of instruction, read that one cover to cover, and then immediately applying some of those, into the work we were doing. So it was all very dynamic, but it worked. And I found that I really enjoyed it because, yeah, as I said, I was using a lot of my different skills and there was, and I had an interest in this thing. But yeah, it was then later when I went into educational publishing, it was still that time where the book was the main product and the digital bit was the CD at the back of the book, right?
Oh,
Um, and
CDs.
yeah,
Yeah.
CD-ROMs, so that would be,
Yes. Oh my
that was like
goodness. I
the,
remember shipping CDs out to my people, like
yeah,
hundreds of CDs, and then you can't update that. It's
exactly,
gone.
exactly. And,
Oh,
and, and so that was
wow.
the kind of the supplement to the textbook, which was still very much the
Mhm.
main product. But when I was there, I remember this was maybe the early 2000s, I want to say. Um,
Mhm.
and s- seemingly overnight, I mean, I'm sure it was a slightly more in a gradual process, but it just flipped where the book suddenly became the accompaniment and the digital
Mhm.
part became the main product, right? So suddenly there was this rush to get what was on the CD. Obviously, we didn't want to keep shipping CDs, but they needed to bring that content online. And then, that's when I started using the LMS for the first time, all of these really cool learning platforms. And you had these
Mhm.
first sort of authoring tools. So my first job, people were designing some of these from scratch. They were coding, they were building these, animated create,
Mhm.
sort of characters. But now suddenly you had stock video, you had stock images, you had templates, you had things that would make this process a lot faster. And then you'd upload it, and we were working with SCORM and all of this stuff. So it's really
Oh.
interesting how, and that was around that time, Amazon said for the first time they had sold more ebooks than print books, right? So it was really, the tide was turning quite quickly to becoming a sort of a digital first sort of paradigm, and that's when this, I think, e-learning obviously just exploded, um, because companies realized that this was really like scalable, right? And this was they didn't have to rely on classroom training or CDs or any of this kind of stuff that, as you said, was difficult to update, expensive to ship. And now you had this new format where people could log in anywhere they are in the world, and still consume the same content, in ways that, in some ways, which are much superior than what was in the book, because you could tell the story, you could bring these things to life, and you could animate things, and people could visualize, and so learning became, I think, a lot more fun. I'd say
Mhm.
so.
Mhm.
Yeah, so it was an interesting time, and so I feel like that was, and I obviously I didn't plan that, right? It was just purely just the way it happened. But all the lessons that I learned, I think, from that point, were really valuable, and we had to really adapt to change, and sort of, imagine what was possible, and sort of build these things out, step by
Mhm.
step, rather than just having it all, readily available. So yeah, it was great.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, and I can geek out over learning and development all day. So let's just focus on kind of you as a young employee learning on the job. This, it feels like high pressure because you were growing in this field that was not even known. And I'm actually drawing a lot of parallels to now, right? In the AI world, but again, we'll get
Yeah,
there. I
yeah.
want to focus on like what was hard for you during that time, as a young employee. And you said yourself, I mean, and obviously you figured it out, but like you had no experience, you didn't know kind of what you were doing, you had to learn on the job. So yeah, what were some of the harder days, the harder times?
Yeah. No, I think, it obviously wasn't always a bed of roses. I think it was a great, it was a fun place to work, because everybody was quite, just the majority of us were fresh out of college, and we were coming with, various different backgrounds, so there's some of them were engineers and, sort of, art, maybe design backgrounds, and sort of, um, other technical backgrounds. And then there were like the creative folks, and like the fine arts and the arts graduates and all of this stuff. So it was a real mix. And I think the fact that it was new to everybody was in some ways, liberating. It meant that you could sort of just experiment and just figure it out, as you went along. But it also meant that when things got a bit pressured, you needed somebody to step up and sort of give a little bit of direction, and that wasn't always there, right? So it was like we were always working through very sort of, things were ambiguous, and they weren't always, um, yeah, smooth. And then there would be the client expectations. We were working obviously cross culturally, so there was also that element. And I think for me personally, it was the first time I was in a corporate environment, right? So it was, I think, a little bit of, okay, this is how we work as a team, and these are, sort of there's, we can't all be going off and doing our own thing. At some point we've got to start to standardize things. We've got to come up with a set of, procedures, or maybe a style guide or something. And some of this felt like it was very stifling, because I wanted to be the guy with just free reign and doing whatever he wanted, and just let my imagination and creativity run free. But you can't really do that when you're working on a, high profile, project for a very important client. So this whole idea of like this, governance or whatever it was, that took me some time to get used to. And I realized, when I started, wasn't very good at being managed, because I'd never been managed before. And so, having to, maybe, have a manager who was possibly, less experienced than I was, or had just joined, or, whatever. That was strange. But again, I think those experiences really helped, because that did happen later on in my career. And then, I felt like, okay, I've been here before. So it felt, and I think also, being a manager myself, because I became a manager fairly early on in that first job, because people, were joining. We were just growing at a very fast pace. And again, I'd never been a manager before. And so I wasn't a very good manager looking back. And I realized that experience again, it sort of, drilled home sort of some truths for me in terms of what being a good manager is, and how it's not actually easy. It's not something that's just an extension of your job. It is, a sort of a full-time, sort of commitment. You don't get to just be a manager for half the time and then the rest of the time doing your own thing. I'd say it's a bit like being a parent, but at work, obviously, it's different, but it is a full-time job. And so again, I think when it came later on in my career, when I was designing programs for managers or leadership development programs, where I would always feel an extra bit of empathy for those first-time managers, people who were just coming into the management role, and were maybe still quite early in their career and trying to figure it out. And it's scary, and you kind of need to, just be prepared to fail a lot and get a lot of, harsh feedback from your team members. But that's how you grow, and I think so. Those were all learning experiences. And I think the one thing I do remember also very clearly is, I think in my first year, I thought I was doing really well. And then I got put on a PIP, like a performance improvement, thing. And that was, so the first time that happened, I was like, wait a minute, so because things were so unclear, there wasn't really any kind of clear benchmarking or sort of performance management processes or anything like that. You didn't really know how you were doing. So it's kind of like gut feel and instinct. And then so when you realize actually you were way off the mark about your own performance, that was a little bit unsettling, And so again, it was one of those things. It didn't feel very, very nice at the time, but going through these early on in my career, I think really helped, because I resolved back then that, I don't want to go through this again, right? I want to make sure that this isn't happening again. And the only way to do that is to regularly have those conversations with your manager, to check in, to make sure you're on the right track, ask for help when you're stuck. Those are all kind of things that have held me in good stead. So I do remember the first bit. It didn't feel good, but I think it was great to go through that at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure that is very much in hindsight, because in the moment that must have felt devastating, especially as you said, if you think you're on track and you're trying your best and all of that stuff. And yeah, and when you said new time manager and that empathy, I feel like it's almost like everyone should be in a service industry for a little bit. Like, I was a waitress when I was very young, and I was the worst waitress, I think, in the world that has like existed. I was so bad. I don't even know why they kept me. But it's that empathy, right? Like that
Yeah.
you grow just going through an experience. Yeah, when I was a first time manager, I hid at my desk for like 2 weeks. I didn't speak to anyone. I was like, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. It's so intimidating, right? And you're like, okay, I'm this leader, but I don't feel like this leader. Who said I'm this leader? For goodness sake. Yeah, that imposter syndrome. Did they make a mistake? They're serious. They really want me to look after these 5 people. Yeah, so I totally get that. It can be so intimidating. All right, and so from there, so are you still in the same company? How many years were you in this company? Or in your first job company? I don't know if we've.
Yeah, so that was 2.5 years. So it was funny because I joined thinking it was going to be a summer job, and then I can figure out what I want my real career to be. But then that summer job ended up being 2.5 years, and really enjoyed it. And I feel like, I learned so much. So I think I was very fortunate to have landed in that particular company at that particular time in my life, because it taught me not just about L&D, but it taught me just about working life, and I think it just set me up in many ways for a career in L&D, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity. But 2.5 years in, I actually quit, and I moved to the UK to do a master's in creative writing. So that's kind of the thing that I really wanted to do. And I thought, okay, I want to be a writer, because that was one thing I was very clear about. I didn't know how I was going to make a living, but I kind of had this idea that I just wanted to write, basically as much as I could, spend the bulk of my day just writing, right?
Yes.
So yeah, and so I went for this master's, and in the UK, masters are a year, and so once I graduated, that's when I then got into the educational publishing industry in the UK. Still doing much of the same that I was doing in that first role, so working with digital learning, but for just in a different sector. And so this was really sort of focused on educational publishing as opposed to for companies. So it was targeted at high schoolers, and one of the things I worked on was English language teaching product. And so again, with each of these, you could see the possibilities starting to emerge. And so one of the tools, and that product was also in just a few years earlier was a DVD. And now people were logging into a platform, and they could hear how a sentence is said or a word is pronounced, and then they could say that word, they could repeat, they could practice, into the platform. and they could get feedback on that. And so from just a spoken English perspective, it was such a much more powerful way of learning, because you could role play, you could get immediate feedback, you know. So suddenly, just from reading about a language, to learn it, you were hearing it and you were speaking it
Mm.
as you're supposed to,
Mm.
which is great. So yeah, so I did that for a few years in the UK, and then I moved to the Netherlands, and that was like the next phase of my career, which was really focused on corporate L&D.
Okay.
So yeah,
So how was it moving to another country? Because that
initially,
is, yeah,
initially
that is a
to the
thing.
UK, yeah. To the UK, I mean, I went initially as a student, and then thankfully, at the time there was this opportunity to, you had a work visa once you graduated, and then so I thought,
Okay.
I'm gonna work a couple of years
Yeah.
before heading back. But again, there was, luckily for me, there was this demand for people with skills in digital learning. And
Mm.
thankfully, I had this 2.5 year experience doing exactly that. So I was able to apply and got some, interesting jobs. And again, so I think, yeah, being a student was fine, because it was, you had students from all over the world in the UK, right? So you just, um, it was fairly easy to sort of find my way through that world. But then
Mhm.
working, I think, in the corporate world in another country is a whole other sort of
Yes,
ball
let's get
game.
into that. That sounds
Yeah,
fascinating.
and that was
That
that
is a
was
totally
fun.
different culture to your culture, to the UK culture. It is a complete change. So, yeah, tell
Yeah,
me more about that.
yeah. So that, I think, I initially it was uh, for a sort of a smallish company. I mean, they then got acquired, but initially they were quite small. And I think the advantage with that is I could go in and sort of, you get to know people very quickly in a smaller company, right? You're not
Mm.
just another sort of person that just walked in and nobody really knows who you are. Luckily I didn't experience that, so it was again a small team, and really nice people just working on really fun, projects. Um, and I think, yeah, it wasn't as, I would say, maybe not as culturally diverse as university was, but there was still, sort of people from a few different sort of parts of the UK, and maybe some from, other parts of Europe. So it felt international, and and thankfully, because I had spent time in the UK also when I was a child, so it wasn't a totally alien sort of environment for me. So I could get around, and I could find my way, and it was a lovely city. The first job that I was based in.
Mhm.
So I just walked around, and I made friends and people who liked cricket like me, and
Mhm.
so it ended up being a really fun couple of years. And then I sort of moved on. So I moved around a few cities in the UK, which was fun as well. But then I ended up in London, which is where I have a lot of family. And so for about 5 years or so, that London was my home, and I had cousins and my grandparents and uncles and aunts that we were all living within walking distance of each other. So that was really nice.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So it
Family makes a
felt,
huge
yeah,
difference. Yeah.
yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. I moved to the UK when I was 18 and we still use maps. So, I mean, Google Maps is to this day my best friend, but we
Wow.
had like
Yeah.
paper, and I was like upside down, like trying to walk down the streets and I have no idea what I'm doing. So,
Yeah.
yeah, moving
Which,
to
which
another
which part
country
of the
was
UK were you in? Were you in London
I
as
lived
well? Or?
in London, but like zone 5. So I lived on the outskirts, which was nice because we had
Yeah.
space. So
Yeah.
we were the only people with a yard and big rooms and
Yeah.
high ceilings. And yeah, it was really nice. And we paid like no rent because, of course, we're in zone 5. So the rent was like stupid cheap compared to everyone else. And we had the best place. So yeah, it was fun. But those map days. I love Google Maps. I love it.
Yeah.
It's the best
Now,
invention ever.
yeah, London's a nice city, and I think the tube was also. I mean, the tube map's fairly nice, right? So you don't. That's not
Mhm.
too complicated.
No,
It's
no, it
still
was
the
like
same.
above the ground. That was
Yeah,
really hard.
yeah. Then it's a bit crazy for sure. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Oh my goodness me. Anyway, we won't go there. All right. So you lived in the UK for 5 years. Then you said the Netherlands after that, and
Yeah.
where you kind of dug into the corporate world, but you said that felt a bit international. So that's nice. It feels like you're pretty adaptable from what I'm picking up. Like you've worked across different cultures, different industries, all of that stuff. What do you think it is about you that makes that easier? Is it just exposure, or do you think that's your natural inclination that
Hmm.
makes it, because I think some people struggle, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's that. So that's a good question. I mean, in total, I was in the UK for 10 years, right? And so a couple of years of that was as a student, and then the rest was working, and then 5 years was just in London. And in London, sort of, I after those 5 years there, it did feel like I was in a, sort of just, I felt fairly settled. And so there is a part of me that is a kind of creature of habit and likes a bit of stability and doesn't like to rock the boat too much. And so maybe in another timeline, I would still be in London, just living there next to my family and sort of riding the tube and whatever. But I think there's also another part of me that likes new experiences and just likes exploring. Um, and I think the Netherlands, again, it was one of those things that just popped up. There was a role at a company there in Amsterdam, and Amsterdam's just barely an hour's flight from London, as you know. So it didn't. So it felt like, and initially it was a year, right? The contract, and so by that point, I was 10 years in the UK, and I thought, you know, we'll just go to the Netherlands for a year to Amsterdam, which was a lovely city we'd visited before, and it was really nice. And I thought, if it doesn't work out, I can always come back. It's not that far. And so that's kind of, what prompted the move. I think after 10 years in the UK, it just felt like, okay, this was maybe the right time to go um,
Mhm.
and experience a different culture. But it was also, I think, from a career standpoint, it was an opportunity to get into the world of corporate L&D, because the UK, as I said, was um, almost entirely within this educational publishing world, and that had become a bit, it felt like a bit of a bubble. And so there was the opportunity to work on some really cool things um, and all of that. But I think the critical thing was, you made all this stuff, you were shipping it, it went out into the world, and then you had no idea what was happening with it,
Mm, mm.
right? So
Yeah.
so there was really this concept of customer feedback, or any of that. It just wasn't there. So you're never able to close the loop, and you work on something for a long time, and you don't actually know whether it worked. I mean, if it sold copies, or how many people are using it. Maybe you get that level of stats, right? But you don't get anything beyond that. Was this actually effective? Did it solve the problem? Did it make people better at English? Did it make
Mhm.
people do whatever they wanted to do? Did it help them do that? And you just don't know. So
Yeah.
corporate L&D was a chance for me to actually work in a totally different environment, where you basically lived and died by impact, right? And there was
Mhm.
so you needed to prove effectiveness, you needed to prove ROI for everything you did. Um, and the mechanisms by which you do that may not have been perfect, but at least the concept existed, and you had to, like, really measure what you were doing and actually prove that it was effective. So that was, I think, also the other reason why I made that shift, because I wanted to see what, corporate L&D was like. And I think even there, within that phase of my career, I went through different roles, and one was very much within the global L&D team. Um, but again, it felt like a bubble. And so then the next role after that, I was suddenly in a business academy role, and that immediately felt a lot more integrated with the business, because this was something that was unique. So you're not just creating onboarding, or you're not just creating something for a different function which you have no idea, but you're actually working with people within that function, co-creating things and building out business academies, which again was like a real like eye opener for me, right, in terms of the role of L&D. Um, so although L&D has been the common thread throughout my career, I would say each role has been a different flavor of L&D, and each role
Mhm.
has taught me something new about L&D. And it may
Yeah.
be that I'm using the same kind of skills and sort of using the same kind of methodology, but the way it's manifesting, or the way it's actually being used by end users, customers. I hesitate to use the word learners, but
Mhm.
that is different depending on the context, and
Yes.
and so that's something that I found very interesting. And again, a lot of this is just looking back, because it's not necessarily something that was in the forefront of my mind when I was making a decision about A, B, or C job. But I think each one looked a bit different, and I thought, okay, why don't I just check that one out. So I think that's also what guided my moves from one country to another. I was just there's a part of me that's just naturally curious.
Yes, I was
And
just thinking that word of like you just have this natural curiosity. It feels like, oh, that looks
yeah,
good. Let's lean in.
yeah,
You don't ask too many questions, or you don't overanalyze things. It's like this. And you even said it before in your very first job, because I do feel like we bring our strengths, right, even from
yeah,
the beginning, and that gut feel you had, and you going with your gut, and it feels like that's a bit of a theme
yeah,
throughout your life. Yeah.
yeah,
Very, very cool. And I love that. I love that you don't want to call learners, and that they are customers, because I have the exact same mindset. I'm like, we work for them. They are
yeah,
our customers. Like
yes,
everything we do is for them and to
yeah,
make their lives easier, better, get the promotion, all of that stuff. So yeah, I love that reframe. All right. And I don't want to run out of time, because I do want to get into sort of what you're doing now, and what led you to this kind of storytelling aspects. There's so many facets of learning and development, and you leaning into the storytelling, and I personally love that. It's super cool, and I think we need more of that. I think we don't tell people what to do; we tell them about something. So I love that. So tell me more about what led you. So you did your corporate stint. So let's get into where you are now, and your thinking, and all of that.
yeah, sure.
Mm.
So yeah, I mean, I think throughout my time in L&D within corporate, as I said, I always liked writing and storytelling, and so it always felt like something I just do on the side, like my side hustle. I just writing. So I had a blog for many years, and wasn't really active on LinkedIn until COVID. But before that, I was, just journaling, writing stuff, just for my own pleasure, right? Didn't have a big audience or anything like that. Um, but I think now, since I've stepped away from corporate L&D for a while, just having that little break has given me a bit more time to write, but it's also given me time to reflect. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that storytelling and learning are not two different things. So I was saying this to somebody earlier. I always thought they were two completely disconnected things. And so I did my L&D by day, and then by night I did my storytelling stuff. Um, but I realize now how much the two are linked. And so in a way, I feel like I've not stepped away from L&D at all. I'm still very much within L&D. That's my world. But now I'm just looking at it through a slightly different lens, you know? And so one of the things I'm really excited about now is bringing storytelling and L&D together, because I think, yeah, I think L&D could be so much better when we um, tap into these storytelling principles, storytelling approaches. Because when I think about even my own sort of learning experiences, that the things I remember most are the things that had some sort of narrative structure. It had an arc, and it had a sort of it was a journey, of transformation. um, and it had a sort of, it also had an emotional element that made me care about it, you know. And that's what storytelling does. I think it brings in this sort of emotion, and I think it affects us in a way that I think just delivering facts, doesn't. It doesn't affect us that same way. So everybody says, you remember um, feelings more than facts, but I think and it sounds a bit cliched, but I think there is some truth in that. I think there is, storytelling has this power. I could tell somebody that, what's the famous story of the hare and the tortoise,
Yeah.
um, and I could say, like, the moral of it, that the
Mhm.
fastest doesn't always necessarily finish first. Or I could tell them the story, and story so then becomes like this really powerful vehicle, to, I think, deliver learning. And when you think about, even before we had words, even before we had language, we had story. And so, when we talk about, human centered design and all of this stuff, what's more human than a story? And I think now, we, with AI and all of these things coming on, there is, I think, a shift back to basics, in a way, where people are just getting overwhelmed with technology, and we're losing a little bit of the essence of what makes us human. And I think that's partly the reason why there's now a interest in things like storytelling, because this is, it's one of the oldest tools we had to learn, and it still has the same kind of power. And in fact, I would say it has even more power now, because there's a degree of humanity and authenticity that just simply isn't present in even the best, AI based tools. So that's kind of what I'm trying to think about and sort of write about. I think not all teachers are storytellers, but I think all storytellers are teachers.
Oh, I
Um,
like that.
because that's, really kind of what a storyteller does, right? It's taking a person on that journey from A to B, and something's changing along the way. And there's an insight that every good story has, you know. Um, so that's essentially kind of what we are doing in L&D. And I think story can really, amplify, or maybe sort of just, increase our impact and effectiveness, when
Mm.
it's done right. So yeah, storytelling for L&D, that's
I love it. And there are two questions I want to ask you, and I might just ask them at the same time, and you can pick one or you can answer both. So the first one I was thinking is, there's this disenchantment at the moment. I run a weekly community, and it feels heavy, right? Like learning and development doesn't matter, or it's just this uphill battle the whole time that we have to prove our worth, and it's exhausting. And, all of this stuff. And now in the face of AI, everything can be done quicker. And, you know, I've got my answer for this, but I'd love to hear your take. And then the
Mm,
second one
mm,
um, is if a CEO or a decision maker is listening to you right now, what would you tell them? Like, why should they invest in learning and development, and from your lens, from your storytelling lens? Because, yeah, I'll leave it there.
mm.
Those two questions were coming to mind.
Yeah, that second question is a great one. I'm gonna think about it.
Mm,
But in the meantime, I'll answer the first one because I think, yeah, the disenchantment is real. And I think, as I was saying, there's a lot of, I think, just overwhelm now. And partly, I think it's because um, information is limitless, and you can get answers almost like in seconds, and that's great. But what do you do with that? In terms of like, okay, this is so somebody who wants just knowledge or information, um, that's not a problem anymore. But I think when you start to apply those skills, you still need to have somebody um, helping you along the way, sort of giving you some feedback, or maybe just encouraging you when things aren't going well. Just, maybe that hand on your shoulder saying it's going to be okay, when you mess up. Um, and I think that's where the gap is between sort of everything on the supply side is really easy, and all the sort of um, the pain and the struggle of getting information is going away. But I think you then start to, I think the struggle is moved downstream where it comes to applying it and starting to make sense of it, and and then you're thinking, okay, but I got all this stuff really easily. So this stuff should be really easy as well, you know, but but it just doesn't seem to work like that. And so I think from our customer standpoint, they think, okay, I'm just going to self-service. I'm just going to find all the answers. I don't really need L&D anymore. And these are all sort of things I've heard people say now, right? I can just find the answers for myself. Um, but at the end of the day, you're working in a team, and these skills are being applied in different contexts where there are humans involved still, right? They're not being applied in isolation. It's not a vacuum. And so this is where those softer skills, or the things that people like to call softer skills, come into play. And you realize that you can't download those off your chat GPT. You can't like just give it a prompt and say, okay, how do I be more empathetic in this situation? That's just not how it works, right? So I think there is this real disconnect between people getting really good at interacting with machines, and a lot of stuff has just become transactional and on demand, and it's fast and it's great. And then you're coming into a team sort of context, or corporate context, and you're finding that actually you have all the theory, but you know nothing about how you can put this into practice, and you know nothing about the real world implications of doing something that you've just read about. So who is that person who's going to guide you through that? Who is that mentor? Who's the one giving you feedback? Who's the one helping you um, take that next step in that development journey? And so I think that's one of the reasons why there's a disenchantment. And maybe, part of it is to do with just L&D and us not responding fast enough to this new paradigm. I think that we are still, to some extent, still stuck in the old way of doing things,
Content
and
heavy.
yes, exactly. And we're thinking, okay, content's going to solve the problem. Let's
Yeah.
just make more content. But that's adding to the problem, because the content is not the problem. It's the oversupply of content that's the problem. How are we picking through that, making these personalized journeys, making it help make sense for people? And I think that's where also storytelling comes in, because, I always like to say there's two questions that that somebody asks themselves when they're learning something. And the first one is, what does this mean? Right? And the second question they're asking is, what does this mean for me? Right? Now, a good teacher, just for want of a better term, I'd use the word teacher here. A good teacher answers the first question, right? But a great teacher answers both questions.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's really, I think, the answer to the first question is usually a fact. What does this mean? The answer is a fact. The answer to the second question is a feeling. That's kind of a story that the person is telling themselves in terms of what this means for me. And the story they're telling themselves could be maybe a very sort of negative story, in the sense that this means nothing to me. So why am I learning? Why do I have to learn this? Um, and then the role of L&D is actually offering them a better story and saying, no, actually, this is what this means for you. And to do that, we need to understand a little bit of their context. We need to understand that first story they're telling themselves, so that we can offer a better story, right? And I think so. That's where I believe that all learning fundamentally, I think, comes down to story, and it's our way we understand the world. It's like it's just, when it comes to meaning and sort of sense making, this is all, story is what we instinctively go for. It's the way we understand the world. And I think your second question is great. I'm going to be thinking about it for a few days maybe. But in terms of like a CEO asking, why should we invest in this? Because I think, look, ultimately you know, we need to answer, I think, a question before that. Is it what is it that makes us human? What are the things that we want to keep when it comes to our humanity? Because I think technology, we feel, it's this everywhere now, right? And there's this whole idea that it'll just a like for like replacement, and it's just going to take over everything and everybody's jobs. And but what are we then meant to do as humans? And I think, no matter how much technology you have, there will always be this need for a human to human connection. And I think, we will always be interested and curious in other humans, and no matter how sophisticated the technology is, I think when it comes to things like validation and feedback, it is going to be always far more meaningful when we get that from a real human who cares about us, as opposed to a machine that pretends to know about us. And this is why I think, the role of L&D is evolving, because we are kind of, I think, almost those catalysts, or the people that sort of make these connections, these human to human connections within the enterprise. Because ultimately, that's what learning does, right? Learning, it needs to, yes, help you do something better, but also ideally help you understand another person better, help you work better with that person, help you understand yourself better. These are all things that learning does, and that L&D, in a way, I think, performs that role of making us more human. And so to the CEO, I would say, look, if you want to be overseeing an army of robots in 5 or 10 years' time, then yeah, you probably don't need us. But if you still want to be running a human organization where real people are building products and services for other real people, then these are the skills, the human skills, that you need to be investing. Because if you don't have these skills, then you don't have a business, so, or at least not the way you do now. So I think that's what I would say. I mean, I would tell the CEO to also invest in storytelling. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There is just so many amazing, I don't want to be cliched, like golden nuggets. I want to say like diamond nuggets out of what you said. It really hit home strongly for me. And that human aspect, I feel, is something we need to lean heavily into. And learning and development is the team. that does that. I always say we are at the center of the ripple effect. So learning and development is that center, that heart, the people side, and that is going to be increasingly more complicated. I think harder because people are opting to use AI instead of asking a colleague for help.
Yeah.
So it's, to me, only more important. Yeah. So thank you so much. I am going to ask our final question that we ask all guests. If you could go back in time to young you, however old you were then, what would you thank yourself for doing then that really set you up for who you are today?
Hmm. I think the main thing I would say thank you to my younger self for is just for taking a chance on a job that I didn't know anything about, and just I guess thanks for being curious, because that is the sort of the common theme that's run through this conversation, I feel like, right? And so it would have been quite easy for me to say no, I don't know what e-learning is. I'm just gonna wait it out and go in for a sort of job where I have more of the answers, or have a better understanding of what I'm going to be doing. But I think I'm glad that I just went in, and I thought, we'll just figure it out, and that turned out to be a very good decision, I think. So I'd say thank you, to also my friend for telling me about the job, and the fact that I took him up on that offer and just went in and applied. And as I said, I thought it would be 2 months, and it ended up being 2.5 years. And it really shaped, who I became, I think, in terms of, my career and also as a person. And I think the other thing I would say is, because of that experience, I've also, people have taken chances on me, right? And just, even when I didn't have enough experience, they've put me on sort of either the big, important projects, or they've put me in a team leader position, and those were all just taking chances on me, right? And I've tried to do the same to others, and that's something, whether when I've been in that position where I'm able to hire, or I'm sort of part of the recruitment process. And it's always, I always think back to that younger me, and I think, I was this person back then, and I didn't have all the answers, and I was still a little bit rough around the edges, but I was passionate, and I was curious, and somebody took a chance on me, and so maybe I should do the same, and I think that was also, I think, something that I'm grateful for, so not maybe necessarily thanking myself, but also thanking others, who've played
Yes,
a part
absolutely.
in my journey, and have always been, been lucky to have some really good managers, and I think having a great manager does so much to your development, as a yeah as a person, and just, on the job. So that's something I'm very grateful for as well.
Yeah, yeah. It's so true. I can still name the person that shaped, kind of my trajectory. So yeah, very important people. Last question, AJ. So, not where can people contact you? We'll put your LinkedIn link in the description, but who should contact you? Why should they contact you?
Ooh. Well, I anybody working in L&D, I always love to talk to, right? And this is a great example of yourself, in just the kind of work you do. I mean, of course, there's similarities, but our contexts are quite, different. And yet we've just spoken for an hour, and so much in common as well. So um, I think, anybody who wants to talk about L&D, please contact me. Anyone who's sort of thinking about getting into L&D as a career. So these are conversations I have quite often, and I really enjoy them. So just, yeah, sharing my experiences. A lot of people are still excited about coming into L&D, and that's always great to to hear and to see. And so I feel like I can give a little bit back just by sharing my own experience. And anyone who's interested in storytelling, whether you're in L&D or not, I think storytelling is just a really key skill, for the future. I think it's one of those skills that make us human. And I think it's great to see it being used in just different contexts, not just in L&D. I'm obviously, I think, in some ways focused on bringing L&D and storytelling together because that's just my background. But I've done workshops with sales teams and with just other people who you would think, even technical teams, maybe just how they talk about their own product or service, using story. And so I think it's one of those things that can be applied in different ways. And I think people who are transitioning roles or sort of, navigating their career journey, how do you tell that story about change and about how, you are where you are and what you can offer, that's a story. So I think anybody with any kind of interest in storytelling, I would love to for them to reach out and very happy to have these kind of conversations.
Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you so much. It has been a great hour chatting to you. It's flown by. I can't believe we're at the hour. So thank you so much.
No, it's a pleasure, Candice. Yeah, it did fly by. I was checking the time and it has been actually just over an hour. It didn't feel like it at all. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation, and keep up the great work on the podcast. I listened to many of your episodes and I always learn something new. So thank you.
Awesome. That is the point. Bye.
Bye-bye.